All right, let's jump right into a really fascinating breakdown of a recent, large-scale tactical operation. This one is incredibly revealing because it pulls back the curtain on the mechanics and honestly the harsh realities of modern warfare. We're going to examine a specific event that recently unfolded, objectively analyzing the doctrine, the tactical flaws, and the precise countermeasures being used on the battlefield today. 64. That is the massive and, quite frankly, surprising number of Russian infiltrators recently captured in a single group. This whole operation was carried out by Ukraine's 225th Assault Regiment operating in the Huliopole direction. Now, catching one or two infiltrators slipping behind the lines, that's pretty routine, but capturing 64 of them all at once, that points to a systemic failure of an offensive operation met by a highly coordinated response from the defenders.
And you might naturally assume this massive capture happened right up on the zero line, in the heat of some chaotic trench assaults. Actually, it was the exact opposite. This was the result of a deep rearguard clearing sweep. The 225th Regiment swept across 5 specific villages and the surrounding areas, spanning all the way from Tuvate through Vosfishka and down to Verodursa. And throughout this entire sweeping operation, these infiltrators essentially just kept continuously surrendering as the Ukrainian forces approached.
Let's move to Section 1, the action, Russian infiltration tactics.
So how exactly does a group this large end up trapped and surrendering behind defensive lines? Well, we have to look at their doctrine. According to tactical reports, these soldiers were deliberately tasked with slipping through Ukrainian positions to create chaos in the rear. Their objectives were pretty multifaceted. They were meant to raid command posts, sever supply lines, and gather intelligence to map out weak points for future artillery or glide bomb strikes. And interestingly enough, some were sent with the literal sole purpose of just planting flags. By raising a flag in a certain village, commanders could artificially claim control over vast, totally unoccupied areas.
But here is an absolutely crucial priority for these squads: hunting Ukrainian drone crews. These infiltrators actively scour the rear areas searching for drone operators. The overarching goal here is to engage them, blind the Ukrainian commanders by denying them real-time aerial surveillance, and effectively strip the frontline troops of their vital drone overwatch.
Which brings us to Section 2, the flaw, the logistical realities on the ground.
You see, the ambitious goals of these missions immediately slam into some pretty grim logistical realities. The very first hurdle is just the crossing itself. Tactical reports indicate that an overwhelming majority, we're talking 80 to 90% of these infiltration attempts, are neutralized by drones before they even make it through the lines. The sky is constantly watching, which makes that initial breach incredibly deadly. Because of that massive attrition rate, only tiny, highly vulnerable teams manage to actually make it through. I mean, literally 1 to 3 soldiers at a time. This creates a severe tactical delay. They are forced to hide and wait extensively in the rear, doing absolutely nothing, just to accumulate enough manpower to pose any real threat or execute their assigned objectives. And this exposes the core flaw of the entire doctrine. The mission demands these highly mobile, disruptive forces. But the reality? They are practically immediately cut off. Lacking stable logistics, they have to rely on resupply drones, which effectively paints a giant target on their backs. It gives away their hiding spots every single time. So as a result, these forces end up trapped, starving, and completely out of the ammunition they need for any sustained firefight. Moving on to Section 3, the reaction, drone-assisted counter-operations. So how do defenders systematically dismantle a threat like this once it's detected? The answer lies in what's called a clearing mission. When infiltrators are suspected in the rear, it is not a random scramble. Defenders treat the removal of these infiltrators like a precise surgical procedure rather than a chaotic firefight, ensuring maximum efficiency and safety for their own troops. Let's break down how this Ukrainian clearing doctrine actually operates, because it happens in 3 very methodical phases. Step 1, the operation relies on constant reconnaissance drone overwatch, keeping FPV drone crews on standby. Step 2, when contact is made, they prefer to eliminate the threat using FPV drone strikes flown directly into the Russian positions, or by dropping grenades on the basement cellars where these infiltrators typically hide out. And finally, Step 3, they only send in infantry sweeps for that final close quarters clearing once the enemy is completely neutralized or forced out of cover.
The absolute key objective here is risk mitigation. By relying so heavily on FPV drones and grenades to clear out those underground shelters, the infantry's exposure to close-quarters combat is kept to an absolute minimum. They systematically search every room, but only after the primary threat is heavily suppressed.
Finally, Section 4,
The outcome: strategic impact and the exchange fund. When this incredibly methodical clearing doctrine meets a starving, isolated infiltration force, well, the reality on the ground is pretty stark. As we saw with the 225th Assault Regiment's sweep, these infiltration tactics might cause some brief, temporary chaos, but they completely failed to secure a lasting foothold or any actual territorial control. The infiltrators are just too isolated and too vulnerable to hold the ground they managed to reach. So instead of a tactical success for Moscow, the entire operation turned into a massive strategic advantage for Ukraine. By systematically detecting and capturing these men, they denied the enemy a foothold, and more importantly, they yielded 64 prisoners to replenish the prisoner of war exchange fund. Ultimately, that means 64 captive Ukrainian soldiers will eventually be able to come home in a future exchange. Which leaves us with a really fascinating dynamic to consider as we wrap up this explainer. In a modern war that is so heavily policed by the sky, where drones dictate both your survival rate and your logistics, is the era of sending isolated infantry behind enemy lines finally coming to an end? It's a profound shift in military tactics for sure, and one that will undoubtedly shape the future of frontline engagements. Thanks for joining me for this breakdown, and keep questioning the mechanics of what you see on the modern battlefield.